Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our special edition and our coverage of the COP29 climate conference, which is currently taking place in Azerbaijan. And today, dozens of world leaders arrived in the capital, Baku, in Azerbaijan, for the COP29. However, many big names are skipping the UN climate talks, where the impact of Donald Trump's election victory is also being keenly felt. We have more details in this report, and we'll be right back to continue our edition and special coverage. Stay tuned.
More than 75 leaders are in Baku over 2 days, but the heads of some of the most powerful and polluting countries are not attending this year's summit. Just a handful of leaders from G20, which accounts for nearly 80% of planet-heating greenhouse gas emissions, are in Baku, including UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. The British leader unveiled an ambitious update to the UK's climate goals later in the day. He said he wanted his country to show leadership on the climate challenge. Joe Biden, Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi and Emmanuel Macron are among G20 leaders missing the event, where uncertainty over future U.S. unity on climate action hung over the opening day. Canada's Environment Minister acknowledged that it is not an ideal situation. He said, but in 30 years of COP, it is not the first time obstacles are being faced, adding that everything is possible. Washington's top climate envoy John Podesta is seeking to reassure countries in Baku that Trump's re-election will not end U.S. efforts on global warming, even if the issue will be on the back burner. But despite calls for global cooperation, the opening day got off a rocky start, with feuds over the official agenda delaying by hours the start of formal proceedings in the stadium venue near the Caspian Sea.
Meanwhile, COP29 is discussing raising the funding for climate change hard-hit developing countries. However, disagreements are evident over how much should be paid and who should be paying it. We have the details in this story.
The top priority at COP29 is landing a hard-fought deal to boost funding for climate action in developing countries. These nations, from low-lying islands to fractured states at war, are least responsible for climate change, but most at risk from rising seas, extreme weather, and economic shocks. Some are pushing for the existing pledge of $100 billion a year to be raised tenfold at COP29 to cover the future cost of their nations shifting to clean energy and adapting to climate shocks. That has angered developing countries and NGOs who argue rich countries and historical emitters owe a climate debt. Nations have haggled over this for years, with disagreements over how much should be paid and who should pay it, making meaningful progress next to impossible ahead of COP29. Developing countries warn that without adequate finance, they will struggle to offer ambitious updates to their climate goals, which countries are required to submit by early next year. The small group of developed countries that currently contributes the money wants the donor pool expanded to include other rich nations and top emitters, including China and the Gulf states, something firmly rejected by Beijing. UN Climate Chief Simon Steele has tried to convince rich countries that climate finance is not charity, but a down payment on a safer, wealthier planet. Around 50,000 people are attending the summit in Azerbaijan, a petro-state wedged between Russia and Iran, including the leaders of many African, Asian and Latin American countries beset by climate disasters.
And we're now delighted to be joined over the telephone by our guest for the afternoon, Dr. Saeed Nasr, the climate change expert. Dr. Saeed, it's a very good afternoon to you, sir.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for joining us this afternoon. And let me start, Dr. Saeed, by asking you, how do you weigh the timing of the COP29 summit being held currently amid the global challenges specifically related to climate change?
In my opinion, I think it is not the proper time. This COP29 came at the bottleneck of international crisis everywhere. I think that now the situation is changing by the time. Now we see some crisis in Ukraine and Russia. And at the same time, in the Middle East, there are crashes everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, the international economic crisis So I think, and at the top, the election of President Trump as the President of the United States of America, who has his own agenda and thoughts about the issue of climate change and the mandate of the climate change, and also the commitment of the developed industrial countries like the United States in the commitments towards the climate change impacts on the developing countries, and the commitments of the developed countries towards the developing countries.
Indeed,
so
Doctor.
I think it's,
Yes,
the,
Doctor,
the
why,
time
in
is
your
not-
opinion,
is not good.
are leaders of the countries that contribute most to climate change and carbon dioxide emissions, why do you think they are missing from the COP29? Does this mean or indicate anything specific?
Yes, I think they are not sure because I think they see that this conference, this COP29, will not solve the big issues, since there was some commitments regarding that how to treat with the fossil fuel and how to go and enlarge the ambition towards using the renewable energy and the clean energies. And now the U.S. is expected to, that's an expectation to draw from the commitments in Paris Agreement, and we know that the contribution of USA in the emissions is about 25% of the international emissions of greenhouse gas, and with this expected withdrawal of the United States from its commitments in the convention, there is a fear that they were not expected to have an ambition target and ambition results from such COP29.
Doctor, now speaking at this conference, the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, said that doubling down on fossil fuels was an absurd strategy. How do you read his statement, Doctor?
I think he may mention that this is highly ambition for doubling down the use of fossil fuel, because until now there are countries that resist this direction. As mentioned, the president of Azerbaijan, that the countries producing fossil fuel and depending mainly on their income on producing the fossil fuel, they need. They mentioned that they need sufficient time to benefit from this and to make their own development in their nation, and that's why they said that they think that it is not suitable for them. Most of all the oil producing countries, or fossil fuel producing countries.
Indeed. Now, Doctor, we've seen in the Azerbaijani's president's speech, he used his speech at the COP29 to also lash out at some Western critics of his own country's oil and gas industry, saying that it had been the victim of a well-orchestrated campaign of slander and blackmail, etc. How do you see this statement, Doctor?
As I mentioned, that this is I think this is the thinking of most of the oil developing countries, oil producing countries, like even some of the countries, the Gulf countries, producing also Venezuela and the other high producing of oil and fossil fuels. They think that they are the victim of that approach, and they need a sufficient time to make the transition from the fossil fuel production into the renewable energy, and this time which was mentioned is not sufficient for them, and they think that this is not good for them to impress, to make pressure on them to minimize the first transition time.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Said, we've also seen the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres saying that the summit must reach a deal that doesn't leave the poorer countries empty-handed in their fight against climate change. This is related, of course, to climate financing. How do you see this, and what efforts are being done in this regard, Doctor?
I think the issue of finance and technology transfer was from the beginning of the convention in 1992
yes.
until now. It's the main topic of the negotiation and the main struggle between the developing countries and the industrial countries.
Yes.
And the pledged amount of this finance was not at all sufficient, and by the time the need for more financial support is increasing, because what's mentioned, $100 billion to cover all the adaptation and mitigation activities all over the world for the developing countries is not sufficient at all.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they mention to tenfold of this, 1 trillion will not be sufficient. If it is realistically paid, this is just pledges, not real financial support. And this is the main issue of the contrast between the developing countries and the developed countries.
Mm-hmm. So how optimistic are you, Doctor, with regards to possibly sealing a deal to boost funding for climate action, specifically in developing countries?
In fact, I am not optimistic. I am pessimistic. Because I think, in my opinion, the developing countries should rely on themselves to follow an optimistic, realistic policy towards addressing climate change according to their economic feasibility. That's all. And the other ambitious activities and programs should be conditional. If the developed countries make their commitments, financial commitments and technological commitments,
mm-hmm.
it's okay that we can increase our ambition. If they not, I think I doubt that, and that's why it means the problem will be for all the humanity, not for only the developed countries or the developed countries, but for all the humanity. The drawbacks will be affecting all the developed and developing countries.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Said, there's been a push, if you will, for the existing pledge of $100 billion a year to be raised tenfold at the COP29 to cover future costs of developing nations, shifting to clean energy, as well as adapting to climate shocks. I know you said you were pessimistic, but I mean, how possible would such a pledge be, and what are some of the steps being taken in this regard? Specifically, that the developing countries themselves are the least responsible for problems related to climate change.
As I mentioned, I think this is I am not an economist, but I think this amount is not sufficient at all. But even though I hope that the industrial countries make this commitment about this $100 billion, and if they do this, also solve the issue of technology transfer and technological assistance to the developing countries by the new technologies to combat climate change, either in the adaptation or in the mitigation approach. But even this amount of money is not sufficient. But at least they must do this. We see that, for example, the new adopted fund, it's a loss and damage fund, and now they came to the problem how to develop this needed amount of the fund. They start about the organization of the fund, how to manage the fund, but the real problem is how to prepare or how to collect this amount of funds from the different finance resources.
We've also seen the UN climate chief Simon Stale trying to convince, rich countries that climate finance is not charity, but a down payment on a safer, or wealthier planet, as you will. And this is a very important issue that is also being discussed, which is the need to drive, these countries to turn to clean energy as well. This is a global drive to turn countries to clean energy. How do you see this drive, and how far along is it, Doctor?
In fact, as you mentioned, these financial commitments of the developing countries towards developing countries, it's not a charity. They must pay because they are the main reason for the greenhouse gas and this global warming and the climate change drawbacks. So but the problem is that the developed countries are not sincere for commitment towards their towards the developing countries, and this is the problem. In fact, this is some type of selfishness of the developed countries and greedy of selfishness countries, and they don't care about this issue for the developing countries, and they pay a little amount of their commitments, and that's all. That's why the issue is that even in the Paris Agreement, there is a compliance mechanism. What about the effectiveness of this compliance mechanism? What about the commitments, the financial commitments of developed countries? They don't make this and command. And also, what about some of the developed countries, if they didn't make this greenhouse gas reduction as they have been committed? Nothing. I mean, there is no punishment or something of treating by the compliance mechanism.
Indeed. On that note, I'd like to thank you very, very much, Dr. Sayed Nasr, our climate change expert. Thank you very much, sir, for your time and your insight, and for joining us this afternoon on our special edition and our coverage of the COP29. Ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up our coverage for now. Do stay tuned for more coming your way on Now TV International.